welcome to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive community online. Our book club is currently wrapping up our discussion of The Fall of Numenor, edited by Brian Sibley. If you would like to join in on future discussions, you can sign up for our free book club at teawithtolkien.com/book-club to receive the link to our Discord server. Now, for the sake of this book club, I've broken The Fall of Numenor into 10 parts, and today we are covering part 9, which I have subtitled The Last Alliance. So this is pages 194 through 215, which covers 3320 all the way through the end of the Second Age, plus there's a little epilogue at the end. This section is actually very well adapted in the prologue of Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring movie. So once you've read this section, I highly recommend rewatching like the first 10 minutes of The Lord of the Rings because it's very fun, and I really enjoyed going back now after having read this a few times. I really appreciate how well it's done. It's very fun, very neat, very cool. 3320, The Foundations of the Realms in Exile, Arnor and Gondor. The stones are divided, and Sauron returns to Mordor. Elendil and his sons escaped the drowning of Numenor with 9 ships and came to Middle-earth, bringing with them the seedling of Nimloth and the 7 Palantiri. The end of the Second Age. Tolkien writes in Letter 131, "So the end of the Second Age draws on in a major catastrophe, but it is not yet quite concluded. From the cataclysm, there are survivors." It's also in this letter that Tolkien likens Elendil to a Noah figure, a reference to the biblical story of the deluge in Genesis 6, and this is referring to him both being faithful in his beliefs and prepared for what might befall. So that was kind of a fun connection that I actually hadn't made before, but now that I'm looking back, it makes total sense, and it seems a little bit obvious. Númenorian Kings in Exile. Elendil of Numenor, High King of Gondor and Arnor. Rule Second Age 3320 through 3441. A small portion of the Númenorians survived its destruction and came to Middle-earth. Elendil came to Lindon, where he befriended Gil-galad and then established his realm beyond Ered Luin. His chief city was at Annúminas. Isildur and Anarion were carried south and came up the great river Anduin. They established their realm in the land that was later called Gondor, and the northern kingdom was called Arnor. In Minas Ithil was a house of Isildur, and in Minas Anor was the house of Anarion, and they shared Osgiliath. The white tree, grown from the fruit of Nimloth, was planted in Minas Ithil, since Isildur had been the one to save it. The Palantiri, or the 7 seeing stones, were divided amongst the kingdoms. 3 were kept by Elendil, and 2 to each of his sons. These stones were used to communicate across distances, and by using them, the Númenorians were able to learn many things that their enemies had wished to conceal. They were also able to communicate with each other, which is something that was pointed out in our discussion. As told in the Akalabaith, Sauron brought about the destruction of Numenor, and afterwards he returned in spirit to Middle-earth and was dismayed to see that the power of Gil-galad had grown great in his absence. Now, it was believed in this time by the exiles that Sauron had perished in the downfall. Tolkien writes, "The ruin of Numenor was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. This good, at least, the exiles believed had come out of ruin, that Sauron had also perished, but it was not so." As the exiles of Numenor established their realms in Arnor and Gondor, Sauron regained his strength in Mordor. In that land was the Mountain of Fire, Orodruin, or Mount Doom. Sauron had to take up a new form since his previous form had been destroyed with the fall of Numenor, and he gathered his servants, which also included some of the Númenorians that he had swayed to his service, that had been in Middle-earth apparently, or had otherwise not been drowned. Tolkien writes of Sauron's new form, "There now he brooded in the dark until he had wrought for himself a new shape, and it was terrible, for his fair semblance had departed forever when he was cast into the abyss at the drowning of Numenor." Sauron directed his anger and hatred at Elendil, whom he most hated, and prepared for war against the elves and the Númenorian exiles. In this time, Orodruin was awakened again, and this was taken as a sign that Sauron had returned. Men named it Amon Amarth, which means Mount Doom. So this is the naming origin story for Mount Doom. In 3429, Sauron attacks Gondor, takes Minas Ithil and burns down the White Tree. Isildur escapes down Anduin and goes to Elendil in the north, and Anarion defends Minas Anor and Osgiliath. It's also noted that Isildur escapes with a seedling of the tree, once again, his wife and his sons, and he's fleeing to seek out Elendil. In 3430, the last alliance of men and elves is formed by Elendil and Gil-galad, and the great watchtower of Amon-Sul was built. In 3431, Gil-galad and Elendil march east to assemble a host of elves and men, stopping at Imladris along the way and staying for 3 years. In 3434, the host of the alliance crosses the Misty Mountains. The Battle of Dagorlad and defeat of Sauron happens, and the siege of Barad-dûr begins. Tolkien also mentions the disappearance of the Entwives in this section, which is quite sad, saying that they were either destroyed, enslaved, and or estranged from the Ents. And it's not quite clear what happened, but we do know that whatever happened was rather bad. Tolkien writes, one of the outcomes of Sauron's preparations for war was the disappearance from Middle-earth of the Entwives. In letter 144, he says, I think that in faith the Entwives had disappeared for good, being destroyed with their gardens in the War of the Last Alliance, when Sauron pursued a scorched earth policy and burned their land against the advance of the allies down the Anduin. The host of the Last Alliance passed across the Misty Mountains and marched down the river Anduin, coming to the battle plain, Dagorlad, which lay before the gate of the Black Land. In 3440, Anarion is slain in the valley of Gorgoroth, where he was crushed by a stone cast from Barad-dûr. In 3441, Sauron is overthrown by Elendil and Gil-galad, who perish. Isildur takes the One Ring, Sauron passes away, and the ring-wraiths go into the shadows. The Second Age ends. So matters of war had become so desperate that Sauron himself was forced to come forth, where he wrestled with Gil-galad and Elendil. Gil-galad and Elendil were both slain, but Sauron was also thrown down in the process. The sword of Elendil, called Narsil, was broken as he fell, and with the hilt shard of Narsil, Isildur cut the One Ring from the hand of Sauron. Thus Sauron was vanquished for a time. Now of the last alliance it is written in the Fellowship of the Ring, never again shall there be any such league of elves and men. Epilogue. Númenórean kings in exile, Isildur, High King of Gondor and Arnor. Isildur kept the One Ring as a weregild, refusing the recommendation of Elrond and Círdan to cast it into the fires of Mount Doom. Isildur took the ring and returned to Minas Anor, where he replanted the White Tree in memory of his brother. Isildur's description of the ring is kept in Gondor and recalls that the ring was initially hot, though it cooled with time. The writing on the ring was of an elvish script of Eregion, but the language is of the tongue of the Black Land, which Isildur could not understand. Isildur believed that the ring missed the heat of Sauron's hand, and that the script may reappear if it were placed in the fire. However, he was not willing to risk such a thing. Isildur wrote of the ring, of all the works of Sauron, the only fair. It is precious to me, though I buy it with a great pain. The death of Isildur. Now Isildur journeyed toward Eriador with the intention of taking up his father's realm, but he was assailed by orcs along the way in the Gladden fields. There most of his people were killed, though his wife and youngest son had been left in Imladris. Isildur was initially able to escape by putting on the ring and becoming invisible, but the ring betrayed him and slipped from his finger into the waters of the river as he swam away. There he was seen by orcs and shot with many arrows, so here ends the life of Isildur. It's also mentioned in this section that more can be found about this in The Disaster of the Gladden Fields in Unfinished Tales Part 3, Chapter 1. Now on to our book club discussion. The comparison of Elendil to Noah being faithful and prepared was interesting because we know that the story is not meant to be an allegory, but we can see that this is meant as an applicability where we kind of see a glimpse of Tolkien's own influences from his biblical studies, but we know that Elendil is by no means meant to equal Noah. I think if you've been following our book club for a while, that's pretty clear. We want to emphasize that. There's no allegory in that. It's just kind of similar. So it's kind of cool. Isildur's motivations. Isildur says he wants to keep the ring as an heirloom of the South, but then he takes it with him to Gondor. He seems conflicted in his motivations. Like, what's his plan? We discussed that the ring is working on him. Like, as soon as he gets it, he has a chance to destroy it. It's not quite like it's shown in the movies, but he is counseled to destroy it, and he immediately, it's like, no, I'm keeping this. I think in Isildur's defense, he doesn't know what the ring is. He doesn't know how evil it is. He just knows it's a special ring that belonged to Sauron, the guy who ruined his life. So yeah, he wants to keep it. I can't necessarily blame him, and I think Isildur gets a lot of hate, and I don't think he deserves even half of it. I don't know if he really deserves any of it, because I personally, I don't think any of us could resist the ring, and that's kind of like the whole story of The Lord of the Rings. So that's just my soapbox that Isildur is not a villain. He's a human character, and I'm tired of this. We also had a very interesting conversation about the dead marshes, something that I was totally not expecting to be such a hot topic, but they're referenced here, and then we also get to them in The Lord of the Rings. So I know this is going to be coming up as we get to our Lord of the Rings book club later on this year, but the concept of the dead marshes was very, very interesting. We talked about how sad it was that the Sylvan elves died because they didn't have the proper armor for this kind of battle. I thought that was just really sad and really touching, that they were willing to go into battle unprepared like this. It was just overall a really sad tragedy. But we also talked about the idea of ghosts, because there's a very ghost-like quality here. It's kind of unclear what any of this means. But there seems to be some kind of influence here coming from the will of the wisp in folklore. Overall, I think there's a lot more to this that maybe we should discuss in its own episode or its own full discussion, because it was really cool. And I also want to come back to it when we get to this section in our book club. But Splintered Light by Verlyn Flieger was mentioned as a recommended reading. So I would like to recommend that for anyone who is interested in this idea. I would also recommend checking Tolkien Gateway, as always, and The Nature of Middle-earth for more about this topic. This section was a little bit tricky to read without having it be colored by our interpretations from the movies, because the prologue of The Fellowship of the Ring has really impacted the way that I read a lot of Tolkien. And so even though it was a pretty faithfully adapted part of the movies, it's just difficult. We kind of talked about this in our discussion, that it can be hard to separate the two experiences. There's the book and the movie, and they kind of mold into one, I've realized, the more you read or the more you watch the movies. So that was just something interesting that was pointed out, and I think most people who've both read and seen the movies, and this kind of happens with any adaptation. So I just thought it was interesting. It's kind of a bummer, but I also feel like the movies do enrich your understanding of the book as you're going. So that wraps us up for this week. We will be back soon with part 10, which is the last section of our Fall of Numenor book club, where we will cover Appendix A and Appendix B in this book. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you in the Discord.